This is really just a short introduction to Q methodology to give those who might want to give it a go or don't know a great deal about it some kind of introduction so they've got an idea of what it might be able to do and how to use it. Um, and to try and sort of make it a little bit more concrete, it's done using an example. So this is really looking at Q methodology, but using this example of exploring teachers' perceptions about organisational change. This example comes from a current project that I'm involved in with partners in school, and it's part of a knowledge exchange project where we're looking at developing new and different ways of approaching organisational change in schools. A lot of traditional organisational change tends to be very top down, senior leaders running sort of planned change projects with lots of SWOT analysis or traffic lights and stuff like that, and seeing it as a very linear process, but actually not getting very deeply into the process of change itself. And what we're doing with this project is using something called normalization process theory, which is a mid-level theory that inductive theory that comes out of health and medical sociology, and he's really thinking about organizational change from the perspective of the work that needs to be completed, the work that needs to be developed to bring about change, but thinking about how you develop that work in a way where the change becomes embedded and normalized in practice. Whereas, part of the problem in a lot of organizations is that change projects tend to lead to short-term change, and then people sort of revert to what they did before. It's not normalized in new practice. And this theory has four aspects to it, which are all looking at different aspects of the work to be done. So coherence is the element that looks at what is the work. So thinking about, what's the intervention that you're developing, what's the change that you're bringing in, what are the aims, why is this being done, why this and why now, and things like, well, okay, if we're going to bring this in, what are the benefits, why will this be a good thing to do, and what's the evidence for that, and can we describe it clearly to ensure that people who are going to be involved in this project have a clear shared purpose and a shared understanding of how their practice is going to change. That then leads on to issues around what's called cognitive participation. This is very much about who's going to do the work. So who are the main participants going to be? What do people think the nature of their contribution is going to be? So if you're going to bring in a particular change, how is their day-to-day work meant to change? What are they meant to be doing differently? And if you're going to bring in this change, do they need to develop any new relationships with other members of staff that perhaps they've not worked with before, etc., etc. This then moves on to collective action, which is very much about, well, how does this then all get done? What kind of training might people need? What resources do they need? And resources aren't just physical resources, particularly in organisations such as schools. This might very much focus on things like, the amount of time that's required. Have people really got the time they need to be able to do what it is you want them to do? And then finally, reflexive monitoring, which is the idea of how do you really understand how well people are getting on, how, what kind of monitoring needs to be done during the process, not just at the end of it, to be able to understand how well it's embedding or not, to be able to tweak what's happening so that a general change that you may have taken from another context, you can iteratively begin to fine tune and change as you're going through the process itself. So this is the sort of different way that we're understanding how to bring about change. And therefore, over the course of the year, as shown here, there's a project timeline. So we kicked it off in July. We had a day where I introduced normalization process theory, and then we thought carefully about what its components are and how that might look in a practical sense within an educational setting, and how schools might operationalize it. And then off the back of that, we then started to think about, well, okay, then, have you got from your improvement plan for next year, have you got a change project that you want to use this on? And then this September to December, the project that each school is doing is being sort of kicked off and matured. We'll do some monitoring to see how it's going. In January, we'll get together at a halfway point to see how things are. In the second term, we'll then carry on with completing the change, and then towards the end of the academic year, we'll assess how well it's gone. So it's really just a sort of a fairly basic project in some ways, but obviously we're really interested in how well this acts as a framework for helping schools bring about positive change. One of the things that I wanted to do before we actually started the work on talking about normalization process theory and thinking about how we might apply it in schools, because obviously even in that very early point it may begin to shift people's perceptions, I wanted to try and capture some idea of how people viewed the process of change sort of pre-project, so that what we can do is later on in the year, perhaps towards the end of the year, rerun the same methodology to sort of track whether or not there's been any behavior shift in the way that people are understanding that process of change. And the way that we did that was to use a mixed methods approach, and that mixed methods approach was using Q methodology, which is a quantitative approach to research, followed by some interviews. And the idea was that the Q methodology would give us some idea of patterns, and then I would interview some individuals from the group to sort of look at their views of change. And because of the time at which we had to do those interviews, which was at the start of the new term, also to get some idea of sort of initial shifts in their thinking. Now, the way that we've done this is, as I say, to begin with, to use this thing called Q methodology. This is an approach to quantitative research that was developed by somebody called William Stevenson in the 1930s, an American psychologist. And what he was attempting to do was to create what he saw as being a sort of very scientific approach to measuring subjectivity. And the process focuses on trying to capture an individual's pattern of responses to a subjective issue. So when you're looking at a particular issue, when we think about that issue, within it, which elements of that issue do you think are significant or meaningful from your own particular perspective? And therefore a Q sort creates a sort of relative set of evaluations for the individual from one end of their evaluation of that issue to the other, and it'll make a bit more sense when I actually show you what this looks like. So one thing that you can do is to capture people's subjective responses to an issue, but then whilst capturing the individuals, it also allows you then to begin to compare individuals so that you can begin to see what the similarities and differences are between the individuals who complete the what's called the Q sort. So the way this works is that to begin with, you need to identify an issue, and that issue needs to be based around the idea of more or less of something. Some more, within this issue, these elements of that issue, you have more confidence about, these you have less confidence about, or you like these things and you dislike those, or you like those less. So in other words, what you're looking for is an issue where you can state a preference, state a series of views about different elements of that issue from sort of one extreme to another, along a continuum. So what I did for the Q methodology and the Q sort for this project was to simply have the issue of more or less relevant traits for change in schools. So in other words, what I wanted to do was look at a whole series of elements of change in schools, or potential elements of change in schools, and then say to individuals, which of these do you think are more or less relevant to bringing about change within your context? So what that means is you need to start off by creating a set of statements, and the group of statements that you create are what is called the concourse. And the concourse is, if you like, what becomes the core of the subjectivity for participants. In other words, you've got a whole series of statements, and they are then making subjective decisions about what they think is important and what they don't think is important, or what they like, what they dislike, etc. And that means that when you create a series of statements, you need to cover a wide range of standpoints. So you need a big breadth of different perspectives, views, ideas around the thing that you're interested in, so that there is genuine choice for the participants as they begin to sort out what they think about the various aspects of the issue that you're looking at. And when you're deciding where those statements ought to come from, how you create that group of statements, they can come from interviews. One of the things you could do is do interviews with a series of people, try to work out what all the themes are that are coming out. You're hoping for a spread of views across those people so that you get a spread of potential statements. You could do it from literature. So you could sort of say, right, I'm going to read some literature on the particular issue. I'm going to look for lots of different ways in which we can understand that issue, and then create my statements from that. Or you could actually ask a group of people that are central to that issue for a whole bunch of statements. No, can you give me various statements about this issue? The way that we did it for this project was that I used literature. So I went back to some of the literature about change in schools, and more broadly change in organisations, because the organisational change literature is far deeper and wider than it is for change in schools. And from engaging with that literature and 2 or 3 publications in particular, I came up with a range of statements that then made up the statements for the Q sort. Once you've got your statements, you need a certain number of statements. So this is what is called a Q grid. And if you look at the top there, we've got the issue that I chose, more or less relevant traits for change in schools. And this is a 25 statement Q grid. So in other words, to have a Q grid that looks like this, you need to have 25 statements that make up your concourse. So you're trying to get a variety over those 25 statements. You can go to +5 and -5, and therefore you'll add, I think it's, if I remember rightly, I think it's 32, if I remember rightly. So, you can have much bigger grids. You can have smaller grids, but the smaller the number of statements you have, the less statistically reliable the technique is. And certainly in work that we've done, we tend to use 25. Now, once you've created your Q grid, what you then do is you give each individual an empty grid and all of the statements, and this is a completed grid for the work that we've done. And you can see there are a whole host of different statements there, things like change is a predictable process which can be easily managed, all the way through to change is primarily about learning, it's a creative process, it's best developed from insights from large-scale data on performance. So looking through these statements, there's a very wide set of views that you could have. And what you do is you give the 25 statements to each participant. And one of the things you can do to sort of help them begin to think through this is sort of say, look, can you look through each statement, and can you, to begin with, sort them into 3 piles? One where you think they're generally statements, in this case, that are less relevant for traits of change, those that you think are more relevant, and those that you're not really sure about that might be somewhere in the middle, and just sort them into 3 piles. Once they've done that, you then ask them to go down again. So if they've got a pile of, say, I don't know, 9 in the less relevant, then you sort of say, right, so this needs to be down in your -4 to sort of -1 area. In that group of 9, which do you think is the absolute least relevant trait for change in schools? That wants to go up -4. Then the next 2 least relevant, you need to put in -3, etc. And you give your participants, it normally takes about 25 minutes, half an hour possibly, to do this. We did this on paper. I gave everybody a glue stick. There is an online version that you can use, so you could get people to do it, say, before a session if you didn't want to use time. And then each person carries on until they've stuck all of their statements down in this sort of almost inverted normal distribution curve. What you'll also notice is that each of the statements has a number to it. So the one on the extreme left, for example, at -4, change is a predictable process which can be easily managed, has 1. Now, what you need to do is give each statement a number from 1 to 25. And this becomes important because you need to be able to compare between people's Q sorts. So what you do effectively when you analyze it is you replace a phrase with a number. So when you're doing the analysis, rather than change is a predictable process which can be easily managed, going into the computer, you just put in 1. But what we do when we ever use this is we don't put the number with the phrase when the person's completing it. We always manually put the numbers on afterwards. And the reason for doing that is that there's no suggestion that people might subconsciously have bias about where they put particular statements because of the number that's with them. So when they're completing it, there's no number involved at all. So what you do is you get them to complete the Q sort. They sort their concourse out, and then what you can do in terms of analysis, that the main form of analysis is to compare the Q sorts between individuals using factor analysis. And factor analysis allows you to show similarities between participants. So it allows you to begin to identify which participants are similar to one another, and by implication those that are different. And wherever you get a group of similar responses, so if you have sort of 4 or 5 people who all show very similar responses, that group of similar responses is known as a factor. So if you've got, say, 3 groups that are similar, sort of group 1 are all similar, group 2 are similar, group 3 are similar, you would have 3 factors. When you are deciding how many factors you might be looking at, there's the use of something called an eigenvalue. And an eigenvalue is basically a statistical manipulation that gives you an idea of how similar a series of individuals' responses are to one another. And generally, you only use factors with an eigenvalue of above 1. Because those that are below 1 are too diffuse to actually be seen as similar enough to be a factor together. But you have to be very careful, because if the number of participants goes up, so does the eigenvalue. So if you had, say, 12 individuals, as we had in this particular instance, complete the Q sort, and you had eigenvalues above 1, that's fine. But actually, if you had, say, 150 people do this, then something that wouldn't reach 1 with 12 people might have an eigenvalue of sort of 12 with 150 people. So then you've got real problems. So using the eigenvalue, it's a little bit subjective in its own right, and part of it is to look at the subsequent analysis and see if there is enough difference. I'll show you how this works in a second with a worked example. So as the number of participants goes up, so does the eigenvalue. A number of different packages are available to complete the analysis, and the one that I tend to use is something called KenQ. I don't know whether this example will work here. No. So what I'll do is I'll do a separate video that just takes you through KenQ as an example. But KenQ is an online analysis package, really easy to use, and it means that with, say, the 12 Q sorts that we had in this project, I was able to complete all of the analysis, all the initial analysis, in something like 3/4 of an hour. So it's really quite quick. Once you've got all of your completed concourses with all of those sort of values for each statement written in for each person, that's what takes the time. To give you an idea of the kind of results that you get out of this, and again, hopefully these will make sense, but they'll make even more sense if you watch the accompanying video on how to use KenQ. One of the things that you get out of this is this idea of sort correlations. So this is the Q sort. This is person 3, person 2, person 10, person 8, person 6, person 11, person 12, and person 9. So in this particular example resolved to 2 factors. In other words, there were 2 groups of people. And in the first group, there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people. In the second group, in factor 2, there were only 4 people. And what you can see here is that obviously the correlation, if you like, between 3 and 3, because it's the same person, is 100, and that goes down in diagonal. But say between person 3 and person 2 was 61, 57, 67, 57. So they're all relatively strong correlations in terms of the similarity in where the different statements were located. There's also, and I haven't shown it here, but there's also one for factor 2, but it's just showing you how that works. What it will then do for you is what's called flagging, and this is where you statistically manipulate it through factorizing. And what it does is it effectively comes up with correlation values. And there you go. So if you look at respondent number 1, then actually they're not well linked to factor 1, but much more to factor 2. So they're flagged up as being in factor 2. Person number 2, 0.77 is pretty high. 0.41 is a lot lower, so they're obviously in factor 1, and therefore as you go down this this list, basically whichever is the much higher value for each person involved, then they're either put into factor 1 or factor 2, depending on how well they correlate. So that's how you get your 2 factors. That's how you get your 2 groups of people. So in a practical sense, what this is telling me is that numbers 2, 3, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 tend to have one set of views about change in schools, whereas 1, 4, 5, and 7 have a different set of views about change in schools. And all that's been done statistically, if you like, is that the analysis has looked at where each of those statements are located within that Q grid, and they've compared how closely each set of statements for each person are to other people. So what this allows us to do is to say that there are 2 groups of people, and then what it also does is produce Z scores. This is sort of how strongly either to the positive or the negative end, the +4 or the -4, if you want to put it that way, things work. And this gives you an idea of how people's perceptions differ. So if you're in factor 1 with those 8 people, the statement which most people positively put up towards the sort of right hand end with the big positive scores was change is a process full of opportunities. So one of the, if you like, the biggest positive defining feature of the where people had put statements within that group of 8 people were things like change is a process full of opportunities, change occurs best when those involved can alter the process as they go, and change is primarily about learning. So this is giving, if you like, the impression of people who are really, if you like, thinking that change is quite a dynamic process. It's about people learning stuff. It's about people seeing change as an opportunity and being able to play around with things. And that, as they're going through, people can change what they're doing. It's a very dynamic idea. Whereas if we come over to factor two, everyone in a change process needs to clearly understand the aims and processes involved. Change needs to be carefully planned before it can begin. Change is primarily about learning. So again, it's still about learning, but those other two, and this is just a very quick initial look into the data. You'd need to spend more time really seeing what the similarities and differences between the groups are. But those top two are much more about this needs to be planned. We need to know what we're doing. We need to know exactly where we are to start this process off. So there is a difference between these two groups in that sense. And I've only put the top values in. If you can see down the bottom, they're just beginning to go into negatives. That's where people really disagree with things. And if you went down all the way down to the bottom, I couldn't get them onto the slide. Obviously, then you've got big negative values. And these are things that these people really disagree with. So what this is allowing us to do is to sort of say, well, actually, there's a difference in views here. These people over here think this. These people over here think this. And, this is something that could be useful in all kinds of ways, not only for research, but let's say, for example, we're about to embark on a big change project. And actually, we want to understand what people think about the thing we're about to do. Because actually, if let's say it's for behavior, let's say you did this with 30 members of staff and 19 of them came out with, we need to be really well set. We need to have really clear rules. We need to have sanctions and rewards, and we need remove rooms and all that kind of stuff. But you had another 11 sort of saying, well, actually, what we need to do is spend a lot of time with kids. We need to understand where they're coming from. We need to make sure that they have a lot of support in helping them understand why they've done stuff wrong, etc. Having that intelligence is really useful, because actually what it means is that we can take that into account when we're forming our change project, when we're actually developing what it is we're going to do. Because if we just fall on one side or the other, we're going to have a sizable part of the staff who feel as if they are working at loggerheads to the kind of change that's trying to be brought through. What's even better is that because we can identify each individual, and obviously I've replaced people's identity here with numbers, you can then go and talk to people, and you can talk through issues with groups of people to see what the issues are and how you might overcome them. So, even as a practical tool, this could have a serious amount of utility. This just gives you an idea of descending array of differences. So at the top here, change is a process full of opportunity is really important for factor one. It's not really that important for factor two, for group two, and the difference there is 1.5. And then as you go down, the differences get smaller. Again, I've chopped some out from the middle this time, but then there's a big difference in the negatives as well. So change needs to be carefully planned before it can begin. For the second group, top of the list, really important. For the people in the first group, it's really not that important. It's not massively negative, so it's somewhere around the middle there, but really they're not that bothered. So, this means that you've got some people who are very perhaps structurally minded, think there needs to be a strong structure in what's going on. People at the other end are sort of, well, yeah, if you like, but yeah, we're not that bothered. Whereas if you look at the third one up, everyone in a change process needs to clearly, I should say needs to clearly understand the aims and processes involved. Second group, absolutely. First group, yeah, to a degree, yeah, that's okay. But again, we're not really that bothered. Whereas number 9, can change be wholly controlled by those who instigate it? neither of them really think that that's the case. There are similarities between the groups, and if you were thinking about bringing around change within an organization, this means that you can see where there are similarities, where you can get people to work with a common purpose, but it also gives you an idea as to where they might differ as well. So there's a lot of potential utility here, and lots of ways in which you can use this quantitative data to give you a huge amount of insight about people's subjective opinions of something. Consensus versus disagreement. So again, just sort of looking through, same kind of idea. Change is predictable process which can be easily managed. Both of them -3, so there's a lot of agreement there. Whereas, as we said before, change needs to be carefully planned before it can begin. Very, very big difference. So you can begin to sort of see these are sort of just sort of roughly where you'd expect to find them, between -4 and 4. For example, change is a process full of opportunity 4 and 1. The actual variance is about 0.617. So it's that idea again of being able to look at similarity and difference. So what's the potential of Q methodology? It can be used in lots of different ways, both practical and research based. One way in which it can be used for a research purpose, which I think is absolutely brilliant, if you have enough access to all the people who've done the Q sort itself, is that you can do the Q sort, you can then see what groups you've got and actually sample interviewees from those different groups, so that you can be assured that you might get a variety of views. We used Q methodology for a pilot in primary schools sort of just before lockdown, where we were looking at teacher workload, and there are only 7 people. And when we did the Q sort with them, when we did the analysis, there were 2 groups. There was a group of 5 and a group of 2. But what that meant was that we could sort of say, well, okay, to get a sort of proportionate number of interviews, because we don't want to interview everyone, we'll do 2 interviews from the 5 and 1 interview from the 2, so that we were still getting that variety, but we were almost proportionately choosing from the groups that were there. And what that means is that rather than a lot of interview approaches where you just take potluck and you hope that you get a variety of views, and actually you might find that a certain group of people feel quite negative about something and feel a bit alienated, don't want to take part, so you tend to get interviewees that skew the narrative to one end. What this allows you to do is to look at the overall pattern and then get interviews from different groups to try to ensure that you're getting a much better notion of the views that are there. It also offers a mixed methods approach to perception work. So obviously this is about subjective perception of an issue, and this allows you to get a quantitative element into that if you think that is useful or important, rather than just using qualitative. And then in terms of other possible applications of this, there's lots really. At university level, you might use it for module evaluation. So if you've been teaching a module, rather than using sort of normal module evaluation questionnaires where you might get useful data, but is it giving you an idea of the spread of opinion, what kind of groups you've got, what their views are? That might give you a far more critical insight into the dynamics of the group that you've been teaching. What's also nice is that, dependent upon your question, rather than it being about negative and positive, so that people are just negative about your module, it could be sort of, which elements of this module do you think are more and less developed? So the less developed stuff then becomes about development rather than about this is poor. Identifying priorities. So it could be that you're looking at an issue within a school, and you want to try and identify what you think people's priorities are in taking that issue forward, rather than just assuming that you know what those priorities are and creating some kind of change project just from your own particular anecdotal view. It could be about understanding organizational politics. So you might ask questions about, different roles, and the statements might be about different roles and which roles are more and less important. Similar with perception of power in a system. So, you might sort of, I don't know, you might decide that you might be looking at, say, a business environment, a corporate environment, perhaps even a school environment, and sort of saying to people who has more and less power within this particular issue, and then you put the roles in different areas. It can be useful for change over time. So obviously we've done this now. We've got an idea of how people thought about change at the start of this process. If we then repeat this again at the end of the year and get those same 12 people to do that Q sort again, we can then sort of say, right, how has this changed? Has it changed? Has the group of 4 now agreed with the group of 8? Have some of the group of 8 split off and gone to the group of 4? Are there completely different patterns in what we're seeing? And why might that be the case? Obviously really good about understanding issues. And then finally, there's this idea that what we did when we did the interviews for this was we actually brought up a person's Q sort and looked through that Q sort when we were talking about their beliefs about change. So in other words, it then becomes a bit of a stimulated recall interview, where rather than just talking generally about change, they've actually got those statements in front of them to begin to hang some of their ideas on. So you get more detail in the kind of responses that you gain. So yeah, Q methodology. I hope that sort of generally explains it pretty well. I'll be making an allied video about using KenQ, which hopefully in its own right again will help make it a little bit more concrete in your minds about how this works. And a really useful tool. And if you can deal with the basic statistics quite easily, an incredibly powerful tool to help you begin to think about people's perceptions and also how group perceptions also play a role.